I admittedly am someone who knows little to nothing about history. It's never been, but it fascinates me as because I'm that. So when people talk about history, especially when you go back like 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, the thing that crosses my mind is, how do you find out these things? Like, those people are long gone. Like, you could assume stuff, but how do you go from a history standpoint? Forget pirates. How do historians go about verifying that something they're looking into 2,000 years ago actually happened?
Yeah, that's a very legitimate and awesome question. So if you're looking at something thousands of years ago, 2,000 years ago, let's say you're looking at ancient Egypt or the ancient Mesopotamian societies, you're looking for two things. Number one is archaeology. And archaeology for the ancient period is probably the absolute most important thing.
You're talking like shared pottery and shared structures, like pyramids in one place and pyramids in another, kind of a thing?
Exactly. And the most two important things I remember a professor I had in college said that archaeologists look for are drains and graves. Like drains to kind of show the infrastructure and the technology, and also because they are literally an underground map of a city. And you can even tell like what the wealthier part of the city, what the poorer part was, what the crowded areas were, what weren't. And then graves, of course, because that'll tell you what position a person had in society, what items were buried with them and why. And then we're also looking at written documents. Now, ancient history is tough because a lot of the translations are incomplete just due to time and damage. There's always the question of how well has something been translated. And so we're always cross-examining lots of documents, looking for patterns, seeing how it will match up with what the archaeology is telling us, what other societies are telling us. And then as we're going forward through history, we start looking more and more at architecture, art. All kinds of surviving art from every time period tells us loads about the society in every way, how people look, how they dress, and what is considered to be valued. What is the social structure? You can usually tell based on the size of a person in a portrait. So let's say there's a man and woman in a portrait. If the man is much larger than the woman, then we know it's a much more kind of male-dominated society, for instance. Yeah. And then more and more documentation kind of shows up the further we go.
Like chimpanzees versus bonobos, for example.
Yeah, pretty much.
So would this also work in the opposite, where if you find a society where the women were larger than the men, it was women dominated?
Yes. Yeah. And then, which was a lot more rare, but we would also find certain portraits in certain monarchies where the man and the woman were of equal stature, which means that they had, if not equal power, they had equal status and respect.
Whoa.
So like a king or a queen in certain areas. I have like in my head a specific example, but I can't remember exactly what it is now.
How do you account for biases in that? Like confirmation biases, for example, that we're projecting our own suppositions on their exploitations and their expressions, and also the volunteer bias of available information. These were artists from a time in the past, but surely not anyone could, say, commission an artist to do a portrait. So we'd only really have the very wealthy people making for themselves these pieces of evidence, which are the artifacts that we have.
Yeah, that's also an awesome question, because there is this massive risk and reality of a lot of confirmation bias going in, or a lot of people having like their own agendas. Part of it has to do with cultural and social trends of the time when certain historians are looking at things. There is also, just like any field, there's just going to be sort of trendy topics or trendy themes. So right now in lots of areas of history, at least in my field, the early modern field, people are looking a lot at cultural history, history of emotions, history of science, and that sort of thing. So you're going to be looking at documents that you're going to be interpreting documents in a different way than, let's say, an economic historian. Because they're going to be looking at how economics really affected society. They'll be arguing that, it's the economy is what really drives society, whereas someone who's more looking at intellectual history might say, no, it's actually kind of like these social structures and social ideas that kind of keep spreading around. So we have lots and lots of debates in history. And then, yes, you do have certain historians who do very much are like something pro-globalization, pro-imperialism, the idea being that, like, yes, Britain conquered 3/4 of the world and civilized it. India wouldn't have roads without it, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have people who say the opposite. No, it caused genocide, it decimated communities, destroyed cultures. So it really depends on kind of the angle that you're coming into it. Now, historians always say they're trying to be as objective as possible and just go with the facts, but bias is always going to come in.
They always have to come in with some sort of bent because there's little left to observe, isn't it? Like, they couldn't have someone say to you, by the way, this is what India was like in 1810, or this is what India was like in 1610. So you'd even have to, it's hard to have an observation and then a hypothesis. You almost have to have a hypothesis and then see if you can find some supporting observations.
Yeah, it's actually in a way kind of similar to the scientific method where you sort of come in with your hypothesis and then you start doing your experimentation. And that's what we have, like, kind of based on what we already know, my argument is this. And then I'm going to try to find the evidence to see if I can prove it. And so a lot of times that means some evidence is just going to be interpreted a very specific way. So just to go to my subject, piracy, for instance, there's actually not much documentation about pirates because they did not leave records, either because they just didn't or because they were destroyed. So everything we know comes from surrounding documents like trial reports, speeches, letters from governors and merchants and the Navy, newspapers. And so we're all kind of going in and examining them in a different way. For instance, we have some historians who say pirates were going in and destroying the economy and thus were a massive, massive threat to the growing American colonies. You have some who say that pirates were actually more of an egalitarian structure who were trying to really push back against a very difficult system, say in the Royal Navy or the merchant ships, which were very difficult. They're saying pirates were trying to actually make that better. There are those that say pirates were actually helping colonies going in by working with different governors. There are those that say pirates actually didn't have any effect on anything at all. It all depends on kind of how we're all looking at these same documents. But a lot of it just has to do with our interests based on how we've read previous work and then the interpretations or the stuff we happen to agree with based on, well, I believe this evidence is a lot more compelling than this evidence.
So one historian's pirate is another historian's navy, I suppose.
Yeah, in some ways, some people will say, oh no, they were privateers, which means you have what's called a letter of marque, a contract saying you're going to be robbing this specific enemy ship. And then you have others saying, well, privateers are just pirates with a contract. And then others will say, no, they're completely different. But that's what's kind of interesting about history is you do have all these debates, but it also kind of shows like history changes over time, meaning that we come up with new interpretations. Sometimes new documents emerge. Which is always really exciting. New archaeology reveals something such as, I think
Hidden
it was
treasure.
well, like, when I was living in the UK, I was there when they found the body of King Richard III, who had been missing for centuries. And then they finally found his gravesite, which was in a parking lot in a city called Leicester in the United Kingdom. So that was a really big deal. And so people who research medieval history were losing their minds.
So this king is buried in a parking lot in Leicester?
Yeah.
Hopefully at the rugby grounds, because that would be hysterical.
No, at a mall, I think, from what I remember. I remember I walked by as they were excavating.
How did he get to a mall?
Well,
I guess the mall got to him.
The mall came to him.
Yeah.
The mall came to him, yes.
So let me ask you a question about that when new things emerge, for example. If you don't mind, I'm curious because there has to be in history like the gold standard. You can make any supposition and go with any hypothesis and do your best to work backwards into proving it. But wouldn't it be amazing if sometimes there would be a present day example to support in exactly the same conditions and you could see it happening? But today there are pirates, at least the way we talk about pirates. So can you maybe relate those modern pirates to the ones that we talk about as pirates today to the pirates of your particular expertise in era of history?
Yeah, so today a lot of the piracy we see comes out of Somalia, or at least over a decade ago.
Why is that? What's up with Somalia?
So Somalia, now my knowledge is a bit limited, so I'm just going to tell you what I definitely know, is that they've had lots of turmoil in their government, which has caused lots of poverty and lots of violence. And so as a result, a lot of governments have actually turned to piracy to get people to rob large cargo ships and also large cruise ships that are coming through that region around the Horn of Africa.
So the governments have commissioned them. These are much like the privateers with a contract that we heard about in the past.
Some. Now, there are some who are also doing it illegally. So it's very, very complicated.
Whoa, so you're saying illegally there is legal piracy.
Yeah.
Illegally meaning extra like outside of a government contract, but otherwise the same activity on the same targets or
Similar. You see, what's interesting is that one person's privateer is another person's pirate.
Right.
So, for the Somalian government, they're like, oh yes, rob this cargo ship and bring back money, whereas the cargo ship getting robbed is being attacked by pirates. The film Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks is one of the best films I've seen when it comes to looking at the realities of piracy.
You approve of that? As
Absolutely.
a pirate historian.
Absolutely. Even
approve of the movie, not the piracy.
Yeah,
no, I do. No, I do.
Also of the piracy.
Yes, I do.
Also the piracy. Good.
Because the way it's portrayed is that it's actually very similar to how piracy was done in the 16 and 1700s. Pirates had their weapons, they had their cannons, and everything like that. Captain Phillips, they have just modern day weapons. They have GPS and they have machine guns, and that's the only difference really. The motivations are the same. The way they do the attacks are the same. The way people surrendered were the same. They try to take inventory when they got on the cruise ship to see what was there, what they could steal. But then things get out of control. If you've seen the film, then you'll remember when things start to go out of control.